Yeah, so this talk will be about Angular directives. If you look at any framework, they use basically components. But additionally, Angular have something called as directives as well, which is a building block somehow. So we will go over to understand first what is directive. I believe everybody know what is component and how it serves the current day's web application. So to start with, wait a minute. Yeah. So before we begin, like we will see, there is a question like, is component is directive or directive is component? Most of the people gets confused to this idea, like what is it like? So try to solve this theory first, and then we can see, go into the detail of the directive. So let's dig into it and let's see how it is internally. So Angular used something called as decorator. That was a TypeScript feature initially. Now it is a part of ES ECMAScript, but you get to pass a properties to that decorator function, and in component you have multiple properties to pass. So I just clicked on component using control and the click button. I get to see the definition file, and I can see one thing which is very obvious: component extends directive. Oh, I think we have some answer now. Now we can say directive is a subset of component, and also we can say that component is a directive, correct? When it is a subset, then we can say that, right? That's a theory part. Okay, let's get a little bit more into it. So simple example, how we should create component. I told you, right, we should use something called as decorator. So you write a class, on top of that you write add component decorator, you pass few things like selector is unique identifier of component and a template and style. Okay, how to write directive? Similar way, but now you write add directive at the top of the class, and you pass few less attribute than the component. It needs only selector and whether it is standalone or not. Okay, pretty simple, basic example. Now I'm going a little bit detail. That's not, you don't have to think about this, but just see, if you go to the API of directive, it looks this big. Okay, and if I just extract the properties, what are they? These are the few 9 or 10 properties out of them. Same for component API, it extends directive plus this many property. I mean, people will say, hey, too much things to learn, right? Why I should bother about that? So, like before we going a little detail, I will show one more diagram. Just now the diagrammatic representation of directive properties and component properties. So this is the bifurcation. So what is the major difference between these two? Component, it has view. That's why it has template, and that's why since it has template, it has style. So you have an ability to pass template and style to the component, whereas in directive you cannot do that. So in short, what you can say is component is a directive with template. That means directive is the guy which is a building block that does not contain a template. Okay, so now what we will do is we try to understand this 8 to 9 property, how to use them and what not. So to go before that, I try to define one types kind of thing, like to find a pattern between how it can be used, and that can simplify the learning of Angular Directive API. So majorly there are two types of directive, attribute and structural. If you talk about structural directive, it's all about conditional rendering, if, switch, for and whatnot. Currently you can use this directive, Angular already provide, and they almost cover all of the use cases. The next type of directive is attribute directive, and if you ask me, even documentation say the same thing, and the attribute directive is very vast. It covers a lot many use cases and it is very difficult to understand. So what I did is, since it was a wider spectrum, I tried to divide the directive types into different type like composition, validation, event-based, exportable directive, extension and helper. Just a disclaimer here, this type of directive are not in the Angular documentation, so we are using this for simpler illustration of how to learn the Directive API. Okay, so you know this simple diagram, like match the following. You know, in early days, like you know, in academics, like we used to have this so that by looking at left hand side, we can try to find what is matching on the right hand side. Why not use this kind of pattern to learn the Directive API and see how the Directive API, each property can be used based on the types of directive that I defined. So what will happen is while learning this, you know, when you define any directive, you see what category it matches to and then try to use those properties in a way like how you want to use it. So out of that, selector, JIT and standalone, these are the attributes, those are very general, so we are not going to cover them. We are going to see all other properties. Okay. Little bit about myself, yeah, I'm Pankaj Parkar, I'm working here in Singapore at Aeon. I'm Angular Active GD, also Microsoft MVP. That's it, like if you want to follow me, you can follow and handle Pankaj Parkar. So let's get back to the topic once again. First type was structural directive, the major type, which is a conditional rendering. So do you know, like other than if, switch, or maybe switch, if, switch and for, what are the use case where we need the conditional rendering? A feature flag, you know, a feature flag is kind of a technique most of the tech company uses to roll out a feature tactically, maybe for certain users or maybe market wise or geologically region wise. So what basically it says is we control these feature flags in a database or using some other platform, and we roll out a feature for certain amount of people. Okay, so it could be possible that when the feature is enabled, you will see the right hand side, left hand side, otherwise you will see the right hand side, you know. And how it handles in the code is, maybe in this case you may need a feature flag directive that can be you know, the star feature flag is the directive that Angular uses. It is attribute basically, and then you pass a condition. If condition satisfy, it shows the login screen, otherwise it has another template at the bottom, ng template, and it shows the template thing. Okay, simple. And on code side, how we handle the feature flag level things is if condition, right? Very simple. So this may be the feature flag code, that how it may look like. So this is the single category that was on other side, structural directive. Okay, let's get back to the attribute directive. The first type was composition. You know, when it comes to composition, what we understand is we create another thing based on multiple small chunks, right? Something like that on high level. In Angular, how you can do the same thing? Suppose you want to apply one behavior on top of some element. For example, directive generally denoted as they carry some behavior and they can help you to put it onto the DOM. Okay, so over here app ribbon is a component, and I want to bold the text, flash cell, as well as I want to blink it. So what I did is I had two directive, bold and app blink. I just kept on the element, and you know, magically it will add that behavior. That's good. How the bold component look like? Very simple. It somehow attaches font weight bold to the element using host binding, and the text, if text is look like this, it will change it to bold. Same way the blink behavior will be very simple. It uses animation property attached to the element, and on click of that you can also event will be emitted. So basically the text may look like this on screen. Okay. Okay, next thing, how you can for this composition API, you know, now one of the thing, like earlier, let me go back to the earlier slide. Now think about this. If you want this behavior to be applied to app ribbon component multiple times, what you may end up doing? You have to specify these two directives multiple times, right, on that element, and that is not good way to do that, right? So Angular provides something called as host directive property. On that, you can directly specify your directive name, which is bold directive and flash directive. Now this will make sure whenever you use component, this will carry the behavior of bold and blink every time. So this is like, for composition kind of directive, you may explore the host directive property every time. The next one is validation. Of course, like, a website that we create always has a validation and whatnot, form elements, right? So for form validations, you can create a directive that can reuse across the application. So how you can do that? So to do that, you can create a class at the bottom, implements validator, and you have to write a validate method since it implements that. Your validation logic can go inside that method. Validation logic is pretty simple based on your code base. And this is important thing. Now you will add something called as providers. Providers is, how many of you know DI, dependency injection, maybe? So it relates to that. So basically what happens is, DI is a dependency injection thing, that is inversion of control. So basically they have tokens. So for a specific token, you can say how it should get the value, how that token should resolve. So over here, I just say provide needs a token, which is ng validators. In Angular, it is very specific. And then you can say use existing function that I wrote here. And every time when it comes to validating this particular directive, it will call that function which we have wrote inside a use existing. To use this on HTML, you wrote a directive. Now use it as an attribute because the selector name is how you have to use it. So this is the HTML to use it. Okay, pretty simple. So next is event-based directive. When I say event-based, generally we have the elements where we need to keep a track of events, like maybe drag and drop, I don't know. Or maybe in this case, I just take an example of copy, cut, paste. Okay. In Angular, how you can write these events using directive? Simple, you can use something called as host listener. Okay, now you are wondering, I am using the decorator every time. So Angular has this way to use. Most of the time Angular relies on decorator. So when I say host listener, how to remember this? Host listener. Host listener meaning the host, which is where the directive has been added as an attribute, and it will listen to specific event, and then the parenthesis will accept which kind of event it is. So in this case, the host listener event is paste. On the next line, it is copy or cut, and the second parameter is array of something, which is $event is special way of saying event object in Angular. So that's why you will see the function have e thing, which is coming from the array. Okay, the array to the function. Okay, parameters to the function. Okay. So one way to write this way, right? The event-based directive. How you can use any existing property to make it more simplified? You can use something called as host property in Angular. And now you have to, Angular has a convention. When it comes to event, you have to say parenthesis. And when it comes to property binding, you have to say square bracket. So that's why over here I am referring to events. I will say paste, copy, cut, that will be in parenthesis, and what I want to do, the method name and whatever functional call you want to make will be there. Same way you can do the property binding as well. So this is basically the replacement for host listener as well as host binding. Okay. The way you should use is, again, use selector on the specific element where you want to make this directive to apply. This was the third thing. Fourth thing, exportable directive. Suppose I have an input element and Angular has something called as ng model, the two-way binding. Okay. So So what if like I want to use this two-way binding to apply the, manage the validation part, right? If the input is required or minimum character limit is not reached, how I can do that? So over here you will see one thing which is line number 5. In this case, it is saying hash username is equal to ng model. So this is a template variable syntax that is used in Angular. What it is doing, behind the scenes, it take the instance of ng model directive and put it on the template variable called as username. Okay. So then you can use that username variable that has errors, valid or multiple property, and then you can manage the validation part easily. Okay. Why you can do that right now? Because of export as property. I think we will look at how should we use export as property maybe in next couple of slides, but it is a way to say that, hey, I have a directive. If you want to use that instance for something else, you can use export as property. So exportable directive basically will be export as. Another example, if you don't use export as, see, this is how you should do it. Use @viewChild and viewChildren to get an instance from the HTML, and then you have to go by index each time, and this is very troublesome way to code. And when you use export as, it is very simple to get instance of specific element that you want to get hold of. Okay. Nice. So see, in this case I use form.valid. In the other case you should have been doing the other way around. Okay. Last thing, so second last type is extension kind of directive. So when I say extension directive, we have generally a case where we use third party libraries. In this case I am using mat table, and I want to do some default values. I want to write some default values for the component when I use it. For in this case, I have a pagination at the bottom. Throughout my application, the pagination should be, 50, 100 always, not the default one, or not I should be passing every time. So this kind of directives comes into the category of extension directive. Okay. So how can you do that? Like how can you write the extension? See, the current way, mat paginator, this guy is a component, and I have to every time pass that third party component what drop down value it should show. Okay. Now how can I default that? To default that, you just need to write another directive with the same name. See, you don't have to write another directive with a different selector. And over here what I did is I wrote, I dependency injected like a paginator thing, and on ng on it, which is kind of on start of the component, it sets the default value to 5 to 10. So now whenever your application runs, it will by default will refer to 5 or 10 drop down value, which is a pagination count. So this kind of directives are very helpful, and those are called as extensions directive. Sometimes people unnecessarily end up writing a wrapper component, which is more maintenance that you have to bear, and this is the best way to do this. So in this case what you elaborated is you played with the input properties of specific component. Same way you can also play with outputs. In Angular, input and output is kind of way of passing data to the component, communication of the component. Okay. So last thing, helper type. So take a simple example. Suppose I have one component, user details profile page, and I want to print that element when somebody clicks on the print button. Do you think this code will work in Angular? Any Angular guy? Will this work? Yeah, it doesn't work. It's not that like somebody thinks, oh, it is holding reference of that user details component, but it doesn't directly. It has the instance of user details component. So how to handle such cases? Such cases can simply handle by writing a directive, or the traditional way would be write a view child, then inside that you use that user details read element ref and whatnot. But simple way to do that is write one component, write one directive that will act as a utility, okay, and it will use something called as queries now. Okay, queries is content children, view children, right? There is a different way to write that thing. Like you can use queries property and say what query you want to do. So I just say form view child, okay, and then I get access to that DOM. And when it comes to users, the thing is like I just say hash component equal to element util. So basically what happened is when component instance created, I got the access to the directive object which contains one property line number 9 which is holding the element DOM. So that way you can just pass the component.dom while printing the element, and that will be, you know, this utility way of is one of the best way to write some reusable code in the directive and expose it via export as feature. Okay. So that was all about, you know, all 6 type. Now let's come back to the initial slide, match the following, like how things are there and what we have learned, how to map to a specific property of Directive API. So if you want to use composition API, you should use host directives. If you want to use validation or you want to play around with form control, whatnot, custom form control, you may end up using providers mostly. When you want to have something which is event based, either you will have host binding or host listener, which is under the hood, it is same as host, okay, property of Directive API. Exportable API uses export as. The best example is ng model. Then extension, which is, you know, you can elaborate inputs and outputs, you can play around with them. And the last but not the least, helper component. It may help you to play around with view children, content children, or alternatively you can use queries option of Directive API. And this is it, like this is the Directive API, and maybe you first decide while developing application which kind of category your directive is falling in, and then use the properties appropriately. So that was it, and thank you so much for listening. You can follow me, and yeah, after the conference we can talk about Angular.
Yeah, thank you very much for sharing though.